The presentation of Toledo Stories is made possible in part by Key Bank, celebrating the strength of our region's history and supporting the promise of its future. Key Bank, achieve anything. And by the generous financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Timothy Messer-Cruz from the University of Toledo. On this episode of Toledo Stories, we present two programs. First, Lutheran Homes Society, A History of Compassion, WGTE's newest original production, followed by The Storied Life of Millie Benson, which originally aired on WGTE in September of 2001. Toledo's Lutheran Homes Society was one of the earliest private charities in Northwest Ohio. Though founded by German immigrants to America in 1860, its origins can be traced further back in both space and time, to the Bavaria in the early 19th century. There, a promising young theologian by the name of Wilhelm Leahy began to question what he saw as the waning commitment of the Bavarian Church to Lutheran doctrines and liturgy. Leahy proposed a wholesale restructuring of the church to refine and revitalize its identity, but did so at the worst possible time, immediately after the failed Democratic Revolution of 1848, when the government fearfully looked upon all reformers as threats to its control. Leahy was essentially exiled to his poor country parish, a post far below a man of his stature. Unable to reform the Church of Reform, Leahy turned his great energies to foreign missions, working to build seminaries, schools, and charitable institutions among the burgeoning population of Germans in the American Midwest. One of the objects of his attention was the newly founded Lutheran Orphanage and Old Folk Society in Toledo, for which he raised money and support back in Germany. And now, Toledo Stories presents Lutheran Homes Society, A History of Compassion.
Funding for Lutheran Home Society, A History of Compassion, has been provided by Lutheran Home Society's Ministry Development Fund, supporting research and planning to fulfill the needs of our community, investing today for services to God's people tomorrow, and by the Bosselman Corporation, and Richard and Ruth Ann Chase.
Lutheran Homes Society has served our community since 1860. From its inception, the Society has been there to assist people in need. Orphaned children, the elderly, families. Founded locally by one man and backed with the financial and spiritual support of a church in Germany, Lutheran Homes Society has evolved into an expansive humanitarian institution serving 25 counties in 2 states. Their inspirational story reveals a history of compassion. When the Home for Widows and Orphans of Toledo closed in 1860, Pastor Johannes Dörfler came to its rescue. Dörfler was the pastor of Salem Lutheran Church in North Toledo. He assumed custody of 2 of the displaced children, raising them as well as his own. It wasn't long before the pastor was taking in other children in need. Dörfler and a small group of prominent residents organized the Orphans' Home of Toledo. They purchased a parcel of land on the east side, and soon a 2-story farmhouse was built on the property. The first Lutheran Orphans' Home was dedicated on July 7, 1862. It was born out of necessity, but its mission grew from a little church half a world away.
The roots of the institution really go back, in a sense, to 1808, when a little baby was born in Rostal, Germany, to a very pious family. And he ultimately became a pastor. His name was Wilhelm Leahy. And when he was ordained, there were so many clergy, he didn't get a parish. He waited 6 years. When he did get a parish, it was in a nondescript little village of Neuendettelsau, which is southeast of Nuremberg, Germany. He was very missionary-minded, and he had a great interest in young people, and especially young women who had a very low place in German society at the time. So he started a service training center to train these girls as Lutheran deaconesses, be the Lutheran equivalent to a Roman Catholic nun. And out of that effort, that village began to blossom as a center for missionary work. He built an orphanage, a home for the aged, a home for handicapped, and of course a training center for missionaries.
In Northwest Ohio, German immigrants were establishing farms, draining the Great Black Swamp, and trying to build churches. But pastors were in short supply, and those few clergymen served several area congregations.
In 1841, a pastor from Fort Wayne, Indiana, was in Germany and said that there were too many German Lutherans in the hinterlands of the New World that had no pastors. And so Leahy determined to send teachers and pastors to America. He would send not only a pastor, but he would recruit families, so that he would send 15 or 20 families to a place to start a church and a mission. So he was really transplanting congregations. And of course that mission work then blossomed into philanthropic work like our society.
Leahy sent Pastor Johannes Dörfler to serve Salem Lutheran Church. Dörfler, in turn, founded the Lutheran Orphans Home and First St. John's in East Toledo. The Orphans Society later used money from Pastor Leahy to send Anna Lutz to Neuendettelsau for training. Sister Anna became the home's first deaconess. In 1905, the mission of the organization expanded to include care for the elderly as well. The Altenheim, or Old Folks' Home, was built adjacent to the orphanage and served primarily as a rest home, providing residents with food, basic health care, and companionship. With the needs of the aged taken care of, the society turned its attention toward expanding the orphanage.
That building, constructed in 1861, was a small frame building in a little clearing in really what was wilderness. As it began to outgrow its usefulness, because of the number of children, some additions were put on. One was put on in 1870, another addition was put on in 1874. Until the early part of the 20th century, there was no problem. About 1910, 1912, the state began to be interested in regulating child care. And ultimately, I think it was in about 1915 or 16, the city of Toledo declared it to be a fire trap, completely unsuitable for the care of children, and required that it either be closed within 60 or 90 days or replaced.
The society issued bonds to fund construction of the new orphanage. Sunday school children carried dime banks depicting the pictures of orphaned children. The capital campaign worked, raising the $80,000 needed for the building, and the new orphans' home opened in 1918. The 5-story brick structure contained a gymnasium, auditorium, 2 classrooms, and living and dining quarters for over 100 children. It bore little resemblance to the dark, dingy places portrayed in the movies or the pages of popular fiction.
I would guess that in the minds of many, the image of an orphanage would come maybe from Charles Dickens and the little boy Oliver asking, "Can I have some more?" That this was kind of a stereotype. The fact is that the caricature of an orphanage that many people have just didn't fit here.
They had a lot of kids down there at that time, and most of them, they were either orphans or half orphans because the father was gone and the mother had to work, or the father was there and the mother was gone. So we had, most of the time when I was there, 120, 140 kids were there. So you got angry with one kid, you could always have another friend.
Running a single household is difficult enough. Running an institution responsible for the care and feeding of more than 100 children required a special approach.
The bell rang to get up in the morning. It seemed to me it was around 6 o'clock. So we'd get up and brush our teeth and wash, and then the bell rang for breakfast. And then did our chores right after breakfast until it was school time, and when the bell rang, we went to school again. We went to school right there. The first 4 grades were in one room, the next 4 grades were in another, and then we went on to Wade High School.
We always said we lived by the bell. Of course, the bell would call the children to lunch, and the bell would call them back to school, which would go until close to 4 o'clock. From 4 to 5, they were free to play. 5 o'clock was supper. And then there was a varied bedtime, so that the nursery children, of course, would go to bed very early.
The older ones, they were the ones that helped the attendants or sisters take care of the younger ones, because that was a monumental job. You can imagine trying to get 20 boys washed up for supper. And if you were assisting, the attendant, you went down before bedtime, made sure they were washed up, helped them, wash the little ones up, and get their jammies or gowns on or whatever, brush their hair, brush their teeth, and then go in and make sure everybody was set to say their prayers.
Prayer, the church, and religious instruction, as you might expect, played a major role in the lives of the orphans.
We had catechism 2 days a week, and Bible history 2 days a week, and we learned a hymn every Wednesday.
They learned church history, they learned Bible history, and there was not an intent to convert, but to instill some kind of a faith. So we don't try to impose our religion on people, but we try to express it. And if it's contagious, then that's fine too.
Reverend Harry Schockhauser was director of the Society for 37 years, from 1927 through 1954. But it was the deaconesses, the Lutheran sisters, who ran the day-to-day operation of the home. They in turn received a lot of help from the women's organizations of the local churches.
Once a month, they would come and do sewing and darning in the sewing room downstairs. The ladies' organizations from the Lutheran churches all over, Stony Ridge, Woodville, Genoa, all the small towns, all the ladies' organizations pitched in.
Those that worked in the home realized quickly that it was more than just a job. For Pastor Gerald LeBoon, it seemed like a match made in heaven.
When I was in seminary, I was asked to do an internship, which all seminarians are asked to do their 7th year. The dean said, I have a special place for you to go, but you don't have to go if you don't want to. Because instead of going to a parish, I was sent to this agency, and I lived in the home, and I was part-time in the church, and I was part-time child care worker taking care of 18 orphan boys. I came back as a pastor in the community, St. Mark's Church on the east side, got on the board, and as a bachelor I would come here at night when I didn't have meetings, and I would play with the kids and organize games and read stories and put them to bed. And after 11 years in the parish ministry, the society board on the retirement of Reverend Schockhauser called me and said that I was their hand-picked successor. Best job I ever had.
As in most homes, life in the orphanage followed a pretty regular routine. Weeks of chores and schoolwork, accented by the excitement of the holidays. But in the orphans' home, with its dozens of resident children, the build-up to the Christmas season was almost magical.
In the church here, the New Year's Day is Advent Sunday, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas. And so in the home, a highlight of that first season was a morning Advent service. The children would learn to say scripture verses and little poems and sing hymns.
We sang O Come, Emmanuel for that when we'd come down into the dining room.
Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel
The girls usually wore white angel things for Christmas, for the Advent season. And we'd go down to the dining room, and they always had a bun, an Advent one at every place with a candle in.
Christ is the bread of life and the light of the world. And circling that bread would be a little wreath, the symbol of eternity.
We always had a big wreath in the center of the dining room and lit a candle every day for the 25 days before Christmas. Once in a while we had a fire, but that was the excitement of it all.
We practiced weeks in advance for the music. The lights were out. This was such a special occasion, and that was the beginning. From then on, everyone became really like, oh gee, Christmas is going to be really soon.
And then on Christmas Eve, the dining room would be closed, and the children would have a picnic out in the halls or in the kitchen, because in the dining room at each plate would be placed all the children's Christmas gifts, which had been donated by congregations and individuals and wrapped by staff. Children would go to Christmas Eve service, and then when the service was over, they would come back to the home, and the doors of the dining room would be opened, and they would all go to their seat at the place where they always ate, and at that place would be 6, 8, or 10 gifts for each child.
We had a gift at every place, and I can't remember exactly some of them that I had. Probably a doll, little girls, and probably some of the boys had little cars and things like that. But we all had a gift at our place.
The gifts were donated from many, many churches, many, many women's organizations. The organizations would say, we need ages and what that particular age needs, or is there any specific that a child wants? Well, the attendants all knew because the kids turned them in to them, the little ones. So they in turn could pass this on and say, well, this little one wants this or the other thing. So when these items came in, if they didn't have a name on them, the attendants went through and knew who should get what. One thing, of course, you always got clothes. But the little kids had their toys. They just had plenty. They really did. Plus, the little boys and little girls' departments, they each had this huge sitting room. That sitting room consisted of numerous toys for the boys, trucks and cars and trains and what have you, that they could play up there. So they actually did have places to play and toys to play with. Of course, share with 20 other kids.
The children here never lacked any of the traditional kinds of holiday experience just because they were in a congregate setting. You'd say they had a pretty normal life in many respects.
It wasn't all fun and games. Just like most children, the residents of the Orphans home had chores to do.
We each had a job to do, and they changed that about every month. So you took care of the little children for a while, and then you helped in the kitchen, and you helped in different places at the home.
The orphanage was designed to provide for itself, and across the street was a working farm where residents helped grow crops and raise livestock.
After school, if they were high school age or in the big boys department, most of them had a chore at the farm.
Well, the boys helped milk the cows. I mean, if they were old enough, they would do that. Clean out the barn, because we had cattle at the time, and in the field they raised tomatoes and fruit. We had cherry trees and apple trees, and we girls, we used to pick those.
In the early days, this was an agrarian society, and farming was the goal of many. And so even in the 50s, when I lived here, we still had eggs to gather and chickens to dress out. And so the older boys would be working and the younger kids could play.
Whatever else the home needed, was generously provided by area congregations and nearby farms.
We were very self-sufficient, but nevertheless, to fill in the donations from the other churches, we had numerous canned goods.
In the spring, we would send a truck out with hundreds and thousands of fruit jars, and they would be delivered to congregations in Ohio and Michigan. And then in the fall, that truck would go back and pick the jars up, and they would be full of home canned food. So the support really was widespread, and it did involve some very personal kinds of involvements. That farm wife who was canning set aside a percentage, sometimes 10%, a tithe of their vegetables and meat and whatever, and it was contributed to the home. And sometimes there wasn't much money here, but there was food.
Supporting congregations saw firsthand how their contributions were put to use at the annual picnic and festival hosted by the Orphans Home.
The churches would always bring pies and cakes, and they'd serve lunch, but they would come from all the churches up in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, and there were thousands of people that would come to those doings.
By the 1930s, it was evident that the Lutheran Old Folks Home was too small, but the building's design didn't allow for easy expansion, and the onset of World War II quieted any talk of new construction. In the early 50s, the time was right to address the future of the Altenheim. A new building was designed, and construction began. The new facility opened in October of 1953 and set a higher standard for senior care, with private rooms, a chapel, and recreation areas. But by the end of the decade, the building was bursting at the seams, and the needs of its residents were changing. A 60-bed addition for nursing and medical care was constructed on the grounds in November of 1963. But while plans called for further expansion of elderly programs, operation of the Lutheran Orphans Home was reluctantly grinding to a halt.
In the post-World War II era, as social work developed new kinds of ideas and philosophies, it became more and more acceptable to focus on foster care in private homes and adoptions. And so in the 50s, the institutions became kind of a pariah in society. And so there was quite a push to empty those institutions. And so this pretty much came to a head in the early 1960s when it was decided to suspend the work in this building the way it had been traditionally done, and to reprogram for what we're seeing as more, you might say, modern approaches or modern needs.
The Lutheran Orphans Home suspended operation in 1964. Ultimately, another program emerged to address the problems of a new generation.
The idea was to take the best of the orphanage and to take the best of other kinds of care and put them together. And so the transition really was from congregate care, 105 children in a building, to 10 or less in a neighborhood home.
The orphanage doesn't exist today, although the problems that we saw in the orphanage do occur today in the type of youth that we serve, where they're not orphaned in the traditional sense that you'd think of with having lost their parents. They're orphaned in the more technical sense in that their parents no longer love them or don't provide for them, and in some cases abuse them, and they have other issues.
The Society opened group homes across Northwest Ohio, with each site specializing in the complex needs of its residents.
LHS Family and Youth Services works with children and youth who are difficult to work with, who have been through the gamut of other types of care and treatment, and who haven't made it, who have not been successful, who are violent, who are aggressive, who have been difficult to place, difficult to work with, in home, out of home, in detention, in psychiatric unit, and have many, many multiple failed placements. And parents, caregivers, school officials, and other people are literally up against the wall wondering what they should do. That's the type of young person that we work with, and we do so successfully.
The Society's newest youth program is a residential care center for the treatment of Asperger's disorder.
The Asperger's diagnosis has just been recently recognized and documented as a low-level autism that requires a particular type of care and treatment. These children act out in a variety of ways, but it's not the full-fledged autism that you'd see in other programs. So it does require a unique type of service, a unique type of care.
Although the setting and type of care needed may have changed over the years, the primary mission of helping children in need remains the same, as does the Society's reliance on area congregations for support.
We have 156 member congregations at Lutheran Home Society. Those congregations support us through their volunteerism, but also financially. They give us the extra dollars that are needed to fill the gaps. Our Asperger's program is being funded largely from donated dollars that were provided so that we could do the startup. And it's those donated dollars that make the difference.
Possibly the biggest change over the last 30 years involves the Society's care for the elderly. From 1970 through 2002, 13 senior communities were developed across Northwest Ohio and southeastern Michigan, extending the base of operations from East Toledo outward to better serve all of its supporting congregations. Independent living communities were created for older residents who, though active and healthy, might occasionally need assistance. Continuing care centers were designed where older adults could live independently, yet transition to assisted living or nursing home care should the need arise.
The need really for the elderly has continued to mushroom in terms of independent living, assisted living, and of course nursing care. And so I say really the big transition philosophically was to take services out to the people rather than expecting the people all to come here to East Toledo.
As medical advancements have increased the average life expectancy, our population has grown older, increasing their need for specialized care.
People want to remain independent. 90% of the aging are well, but it's that safety and security that we have on a campus that offers all our services from independent to assisted living to nursing home. Even though somebody might not want to be in the nursing home, it's there if I need it.
In 1994, Pastor Gerald LeBoon retired, and David Roberts was named his successor. Soon afterwards, the Lutheran Orphans and Old Folks Home Society became Lutheran Home Society, consolidating their name to better reflect their services. But their mission remains virtually unchanged after almost 150 years.
We were founded by a Lutheran missionary before Abraham Lincoln was president. So we've been around a long time, and we have that heritage of faith, and that's what founded us.
That probably stems, at least in my mind, to what used to be our theme text from the scripture, which says that religion that is pure and undefiled is to take care of the widows and the orphans and to keep oneself unspotted in the world. That to care for orphans and ultimately later elderly people was a fulfillment of Christ's mission and command, that if you truly have the faith, this is the kind of person you're going to be. You're going to be outgoing, not self-centered. You're going to focus on the needs of other people, and you're going to try to do something about it.
As a social ministry organization of the church, it's an issue of faithfulness, that we're called to do the work. And we're called to do it in the context of our values. You need integrity, you need quality, you need stewardship, and you need wholeness of life and equality and justice. Those, in a nutshell, are our values, and we apply those values every day, as we have since 1860, in order to deliver our services.
In the summertime, then we would go swimming out to Gem Beach or East Harbor or someplace. We went in Hecklinger's truck. It was their vegetable truck. We were like a bunch of cattle standing there, but it was fun. We'd be so close you couldn't hardly fall down, so. But the swimming was nice at Gem Beach, and sometimes we'd go during the day and spend the whole day there at Gem Beach.
Funding for Lutheran Home Society, A History of Compassion, has been provided by Lutheran Home Society's Ministry Development Fund, supporting research and planning to fulfill the needs of our community, investing today for services to God's people tomorrow, and by the Bosselman Corporation, and Richard and Ruth Ann Chase.